Hello and good morning. My name is Ann Mavity, and I am the Executive Director of the Minnesota Housing Partnership. And we are delighted that you have joined us this morning. We have 140 folks signed up today. So we are excited about the participation as well as a really exciting lineup today. So welcome to Minnesota Housing Partnership's call on our federal and state legislative updates. As you know, we are a more than 30-year nonprofit, and we work collaboratively with housing stakeholders throughout Minnesota to advance policies and investments to ensure that everyone has access to affordable housing. MHP is hosting these Friday calls to share timely and critical information with all of you and other housing stakeholders on policy and legislative proposals that impact all of our work in advancing affordable housing. So there is a lot going on in our public sphere these days, both at the state and federal levels. With committee work now has begun in earnest at the state level, and certainly this week, the inauguration of President and Vice President Biden and Harris was a particularly notable event. And along with that, the federal balance of power in the U.S. Senate changing over from Republican to Democrat, just as a new Democratic administration is coming in, has put an interesting new spin on what's coming forward in terms of housing proposals. So there's a lot going on at the federal level. And we are delighted today that we will have Sarah Saadian, the Vice President of Public Policy with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, joining us. And she'll talk about what this might mean for affordable housing proposals at the federal level. We're also honored today, as part of our community perspective, what's happening on the ground, to host Chief Executive of the Mille Band of Ojibwe, Melanie Benjamin, who will be talking about housing challenges in her community. But right now, we're going to start with MHP's Deputy Director of Policy, Libby Murphy, who will be hosting a conversation right now with our state representatives, Kaohly, who's a majority whip, and State Representative Aisha Gomez, who's the chair of the Preventing Homelessness Division as well. And both also serve on the Housing, Finance, and Policy Committee in the House and have been champions of affordable housing and worked closely with MHP. So with that, Libby, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ann, and thank you so much to our state representatives who are here with us today. Really excited about this panel. Had an opportunity over the past 2 years, now into the third year, of working closely with both of these lawmakers. So excited to have them on and feature them. Just as a quick update about what's happening at the state capitol, we're our third week into session. Things are moving both quickly and slowly. It's a jam-packed session, but there's a backlog of bills. A lot of informational hearings have been happening, and Representative Gomez will certainly tell us about the hearings that she's been conducting in the Preventing Homelessness subdivision that she chairs, and both are on the Housing Committee, and there's been some great testimony, including from our Executive Director, Ann Mavity, in that committee, and just to lay the groundwork for things to come and the bills that lawmakers will hear as they relate to housing. So just with that, I want to turn it over to our lawmakers. And first, I'm going to introduce Representative Herr. I did see that she's on. So Representative Herr is an advocate, a champion on housing issues, and she's the majority whip, as Ann mentioned. She also sits on the Housing, Finance, and Policy Committee, the Tax Committee, as well as the Judiciary Committee. And these are all committees that MHP will be very active in this session, tracking legislation, and have some pieces of legislation of our own. So Representative Herr, welcome. And we just, 5 minutes or so just to tell us a little bit about your priorities, especially as majority whip. That's a unique role that you serve. And when I talked to you, you mentioned a little bit how you are looking for those things that are going to have caucus-wide support. And I'm curious what you predict for this session. And then also some of your other priorities in those 3 committees that I mentioned.
Absolutely. Thank you, Libby. And thank you everyone for having me here today. As all of you know, housing is really important to me. And for those who may have not heard, and I'm not going to use a lot of time because I have 5 minutes, but housing is important for me because I know that to me, it lives at the center of the intersection of how someone is going to do, their family is going to do in school, how their health is going to be, how if they're going to be able to get a job, if they're going to, be able to accumulate wealth and be able to pass that on. Like, it just, to me, is the center of everything in every other part of someone else's, the other parts of their lives. And so housing really matters. And I know when I think about what it means to be in the committees that I sit on and what I care about, I just want to share really quick that in the last biennium, I carried a number of bills. And for me, tenant protection is really important. So in housing, I looked at, I carried bills that looked at repealing certain requirements around housing tax credits or appropriating money for housing mediation for eviction protection, landlords from prohibiting them from imposing fees and entry into restricted properties and then also residential lease. And, what does that mean if a tenant needs to have repairs done and, the process for that, or prorated rents for the last month. And so there are a number of bills that I carried, and I will be carrying some of those bills again in this biennium because, we didn't make a lot of progress in housing last year. That was very disappointing, even though we were able to pass some housing relief during the special sessions. There's still so much more that we have to do about that. And so know that I will be continuing some of these bills into this biennium as well. I also carried bills that actually ended up in judiciary and in taxes. And a number of those bills, I think, are really important for us to continue. That last year, there might not have been appetite to do some of these things, but this year, with the way our budget is looking, there may be more consensus around looking at, even like a bill I carried last year around related to civil law and requiring courts to provide certain types of notices, for liens in tenant remedy actions, or, attorney's fee and and award limitations and things like that. And so I think that those types of bills might not have been like the high profile bills that people want to see done, but those are reforms that we really need, and that comes through judiciary and civil law. And then in taxes, I'm still learning a lot about what happens in taxes and what we need to do. And one of the bills that was really important to me was really understanding how we are building housing and to keep them affordable or to make them affordable. And one of the bills that was important to me was a 4D study to really understand, who is impacted, who benefits from our programs that we create in order to make affordable housing. And so I continue to work on that particular piece of it because that's important to me. So those are some of my priorities. And I kind of whipped through them kind of fast, but we have a limited time. And I want to make sure that we have enough time to talk about other things. But I would say that as my role as the majority whip, that I get to work really closely with both the speaker and the majority leader. And I get to be at the table when we have discussions about what our priorities are. Even when we launched this year, what are our top priorities for the DFL for the 2021 session? We looked at what we were going to do from unfinished work from last year, and housing was one of those pieces. But we also, talk a lot about what do we need to do in this time and in this environment to continue our work, and that we cannot continue to operate from deficit mindset. That housing and the needs within housing have only been exacerbated with the current pandemic. And so how do we look at housing and support that work and ensure that even within that work that needs reform, how do we apply an equity lens to that work as well, and know who are some of our most marginalized community members who are being impacted when we do make housing policy, who is left out, who gets to benefit. And so those are all really important things to me, and knowing that I get to be at the table with Melissa and Ryan in doing this work is something that is very valuable, and bringing a lens that might not have always been there around the equity piece of it in housing is really important to me as well. And so those are kind of my priorities and sort of my role as the whip and what that means in shaping what we do as a caucus and moving forward on pushing the housing agenda. Was that under 5 minutes, Libby?
Yes, that was great. And just to remind folks that we will be opening things up to questions with both Representative Her and Representative Gomez after we hear from Representative Gomez. So please use the chat feature. This isn't the last we'll hear from you. So that was a great overview of your priorities and things that you'll be focused on this session. But put questions for Representative Her in the chat feature, please. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Representative Gomez. Representative Gomez is the chair of the new Preventing Homelessness Subdivision. This is a committee that I think has been sorely missed for the past number of years as our homelessness crisis has risen, and certainly been exacerbated by the pandemic. And so we're extremely lucky also to have Representative Gomez chairing this committee. And so Representative Gomez, I want to make sure that I give you 5 minutes to tell us a little bit about your committee priorities and some of the other work that you're going to be doing, especially in taxes and property taxes, as well as the Housing Committee.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. Appreciate that, Libby. Yeah, so Rep. Her and I are both in our second terms and kind of have both stepped into these leadership roles this time. So I know, just speaking for myself, I'm kind of, it's a new, this is a new committee, my committee, the division that I'm chairing. And so, I'm not going to get like a target. So I don't have finance accounts in my committee. And so we're kind of like figuring out how it is that we can best like leverage this platform to help to kind of like lift up the issues around that are facing people experiencing homelessness, and especially kind of unsheltered homelessness, how it is that we can use this unprecedented moment that we're in of increased visibility of people who are experiencing homelessness to try to help make some of the connections that need to be made and get some of the sort of resources and coordination that we need to bring to bear to serve those communities. Rep. Her kind of talked, I think, really, really beautifully as usual about just sort of the importance of housing and of home to people. And so that's sort of just like the baseline principle for me, is that like, we live in a rich state, in a rich country, the richest country that's ever existed on the face of the earth, and it is an absolute offense that people are living in the streets. It is an offense that people are living in our parks. And it's not an immutable fact. It is the result of policy choices. It's the result of benign neglect in some cases. It's the result of the intersections of like kind of marginalization that people who are experiencing homelessness tend to face in our world. And so, in the first couple, we're just in our third week. So far we've heard from our partners at the Minnesota Interagency Council to End Homelessness, who do, a bunch of amazing kind of like coordination work across the state. And we heard this week from people who have experienced homelessness or are experiencing homelessness currently. And that's sort of, this sort of principle that I definitely like bring to this work is just that like, I don't want us to come up with responses and programs that are the result of our assumptions about what people need. I want us to listen to people who are in this situation and figure out how it is that we as a committee, as a legislature, as a government, as a society that cares for one another, how it is that we can properly respond. So God, I don't know. I mean, this is, the interesting thing about homelessness is that to me, it's just like it really exists at this nexus of all of these systems. I mean, it's sort of like the issues around housing supply and cost burden, the tenant protections that Representative Her is working on, and kind of the looming eviction crisis. And I mean, it's not looming, right? We're in an eviction crisis. We have been in an eviction crisis, especially in BIPOC communities. There are a lot of issues around sort of like the funding pieces are like about bonding, investing in public housing is a big priority of mine because we're way behind. And to me, it's like, I would like us to move more toward viewing housing as a public good and as a necessity of life. And that just sort of that we need to acknowledge that, as Representative Her said, if you don't have a place to lay your head, how can your kids succeed in school? How can you participate fully in our economy? How can we expect people to have good and full lives that don't need other supports and don't have other public costs if we don't make sure that people are stably housed first? So, I mean, to that point, I'm really excited about the work that Beacon is doing and with Representative Howard on the statewide housing assistance program. I think for me, it's very, very important that we define the scope of the issues that we're facing. And so that bill does that. It says if we're going to support cost burdened households, it's $1 billion a year. Like, let's be real about the scope of what we're facing. I I like woke up, or it was actually very late, middle of the night on our first like day of full like committees. It was like last Tuesday, and I had to write Melissa and the speaker and the majority leader this like kind of crazy text message, because I had this realization that I'm like, I had my sort of first like really full, like I was worked for 14 hours that day and went to all these committees, and I was like, I'm just working on taxes and housing. Like that's what I'm doing. I serve on 2 housing committees and 2 tax committees, and I'm just like really thrilled, and it really feels like the right place for me to be. And so I'm really thankful for that, and thankful for the support of this group in like so many different ways. All like many of you have just like supported the work at the intersection of housing and taxes, and supported me personally, and I'm really thankful for that. So just a couple specifics that I wanted to lift up in the tax and housing space are just that, you know, I personally, like when I look at what we've done to support home ownership in Minnesota, obviously there's this sort of like spectrum of housing that we all, the continuum of housing that we all deal with every day. And, we basically there are these barriers to people of color in particular having access to home ownership that are really like the deep racial disparity in home ownership is supported by our policies. It's supported by the fact that we invest $87 million a year in the mortgage interest deduction, which is disproportionately like taken by the highest wealth households in Minnesota. The fact that we have a $20 million target overall in the housing budget, and then we sort of have this like backdoor tax expenditure that costs $90 million each year that upholds the deepest homeownership disparity in the country is really a problem, and we're working on that. We're also working with on the mortgage and deed increment capture to support affordable homeownership opportunities. And I'm working on an affordable housing tax aid. It's kind of a little bit like a way to use tax expenditures to further support the work that a lot of folks in this group have advocated for in terms of like getting a really good sort of housing infrastructure bond, housing infrastructure bonds in the bonding bill. I'm going to stop there because I've been talking for too much, but I appreciate it and look forward to the conversation.
Well, I'm certainly going to follow up because there is a question in the chat about kind of this deficit that, and Representative Herr brought up this deficit mindset. But first I wanted to ask Representative Herr about, so the House convened a special committee that on racial justice this past fall and winter. It came out with a report that included several housing proposals. And I'm curious what you think the prospect of some of those housing proposals will be, and what support that the housing advocates can give to uplifting some of those to make sure that that report lives on in session through some active bills and active campaign work, because there's a lot of really wonderful recommendations in that report.
Thank you, Libby, for that question. And I always start by saying that I am an eternal optimist, right? Because if I weren't, I would not be a survivor of war and a refugee to a new country and have to start over. Like, you have to be an eternal optimist, right, to overcome those types of adversities. And so I believe that the recommendations that we made out of that select committee, that people, all of us, any one of us who do anything on housing will have the will to actually execute on the housing recommendation. That is just my pure optimism around this. But but the reality is that even as we sat in our last select committee meeting, though everyone within that committee was like, yes, we should absolutely do this, but some of these things never came through committee, and and we haven't heard any testimony on some of these pieces, and because we included so many recommendations across housing and education and just so many areas that there wasn't time to have a hearing on every single one of these pieces, right? And so to hear already pushback saying we can't support every single one of these recommendations in here because these process reasons, right? And so that tells me that what our colleagues across the aisle are signaling is that they they will have a challenge in supporting us in these particular recommendations. And I think that personally in the housing piece of it, I mean, it seems to me such a small ask, right? Like to increase home improvement support for, both owner occupied homes and rental properties, right? Because we know about how we disproportionately value BIPOC people, especially our Black community, their homes, we undervalue them, right? So they're not participating. And so how do we help create programs that allow them to increase the values of their home? I mean, 5% of funds in the state investment portfolio should be invested in BIPOC real estate development. Like 5%, right? That's such a small amount. Or just to establish a memorandum of understanding, right, with top financial institutions. Like that doesn't even require us here at the state to do something. I feel like the ask is so small and it is so doable. And my hope is that people will come to realize that, and that we need to continue to push out this report as much as possible. Like small things that create a just cause policy for termination of tenancy. Like those things are so small and it doesn't cost any money to do this, right? And so like for me, my hope is that if we all push at least the provisions that don't require any kind of like cost, that we'll be able to at least try, get bipartisan support in those pieces of it so that we can move forward. But again, like I said, I'm an eternal optimist. I think that we can do them all. They're not a big ask, but that we do know that there is quite a bit of pushback from our partners who may not always see this as something important to move forward, especially in this type of economic times we're in. But your support and how all of you can help is to help us move at least the pieces that have no cost to us doing them. And so anything that might come through judiciary that might be helpful in reforming housing, and housing laws. And so that to me is how all of you can help me and support our group in pushing this forward.
Thank you. That's really great feedback. So there was a question in here about, there's been a lot of conversations about how the cost of housing is really coming in through regulations and fees from cities. And that is the position that I think the Senate has taken, the majority in the Senate has taken over the past biennium. How do you counter that with the ask for new investments? What is the strategy there? And how do we make sure that we don't, as you said, we don't come in with a deficit mindset and look at where we can save money or reduce costs versus adding new investments? And so maybe Representative Gomez, if you want to answer that first, and then Representative Herr.
Yeah, thank you. Again, Representative Herr sort of referenced this in her opening remarks, but I think that this is one of the big challenges of this session is in everything that we do and in everything that we say, we need to be really critical about kind of even implicitly buying into the frame of that, like we don't have enough. Because when we get into this like deficit mindset, the cuts happen on the backs of our communities. They happen on the backs of BIPOC people and our children and people in poverty and people who need a hand. And so, so I guess like from my perspective as somebody who serves on the tax committee, and, I am currently having research like draft, $6 billion maybe in revenue increases via these bills, that most of which would not impact middle or lower income people at all. It's like we need to be able to make the argument like that folks at the top are making out really, really well in this economy, and we need to ask them to share that wealth. That is part of what it means to be in community together. And taxes are not a dirty word, and revenue is not a dirty word. And as much as we talk about how budgets are moral documents, tax bills are moral documents and create the contours of the ways that we're able to show up for each other. So that's sort of the big picture kind of piece that I wanted to cover. I might have missed the specific part of the question. I kind of think I like.
No, that's okay. That's fine.
Is that okay?
Representative Herr, do you have anything you want to add to that? Otherwise, I'll ask one more question.
Libby, could you just, I want to make sure that I did catch the crux of your question, and because I think I might have something to add really quick.
I think just, how do we ensure that we don't move forward this session with this deficit mind frame, looking out next session, there's a deficit projection. And things on the table do include regulatory or fee reductions, and but really that we need more investments in housing. We're not going to solve our housing crisis by solely reducing costs. And how do we?
Yes, and I think, and I completely agree with Representative Gomez about, I come from the finance world, right? And like when we talk about the economy and the markets, they're so different, right? And everybody sort of equates them. Sure, our economy isn't doing well, but the markets are doing great. And those who have been our top earners and those who have the privilege and the ability to invest in markets have made a ton of money during this really tough time when everybody else has been suffering. So how do we be in community and say some people who have been doing well should be participating more in providing funds into these programs that we want to do through taxes, right? So I completely agree with that. What I would also say is that I think that the more that we can lift up the issues of when we say that we don't have the money to invest in housing and homelessness, right? Well, what is the cost? There's always a cost. The cost is either going to come on the front end or the back end, right? So when we're having we're having to build emergency shelters because we didn't invest in housing, and now not enough people have a place to go, and we don't have anywhere to put them because we didn't invest in affordable housing, right? So what is the cost now? What is the, and what is the cost in healthcare of people who are unsheltered and who are needing to get emergency medical care, right? What is happening? Like, what are the costs? And these costs are happening on the back end. And the more we can show and lift up the fact that the investment now, even in this tough economic time, the investment and the small investment that we make when we look at how much we actually invest in housing and homelessness, right? Any additional investment is still a small investment, and yet that is going to save us from the costs that come from us thinking that it is too much to invest in this right now. And so I think that the more that we can lift up that issue and show our communities, show lawmakers, show people who are part of this housing work, that the cost when we wait on the investment is far exceeds, what we would have just put if we would have just put some money in on the front end. And so to me, like, that's really critical that we're really effective and good at doing that, especially in this time.
Well, I just want to thank both of you so much for joining us this morning. And I wish we had more times. There were some with both of you. There's more comments and questions in the chat, and I'll make sure to pass those along to you. But I have to pass it back to Anne for our next guest speaker. So I look forward to working with both of you. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. It was really great having you on.
Thank
Thank
you
you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the representatives and Libby for that conversation. On each call, in addition to the state and federal legislative updates, we like to highlight what's happening on the ground in our communities around Minnesota so that we can learn about the challenges and struggles with affordable housing and really how real people are being impacted. These stories and reporting, it just really brings to life the work of our various legislative bodies, why we do this work, and frankly, what we need to be paying attention to. So today, with our report from the community, our report from the ground, we have the distinct honor of hosting Chief Executive of the Mille Band of Ojibwe. Chief Executive Melanie Benjamin, she leads the executive branch of the tribal government, which implements the band's laws and programs. And as a sovereign nation, her role in the Mille Band is equal to the president of a sovereign nation. And she was first elected chief executive in 2000 and has been reelected multiple times since, serving 4-year terms. And I believe maybe the longest serving elected official in tribal government, at least in Minnesota. So for the past 2 years, Chief Executive Benjamin also currently serves on the Minnesota Housing Board. So, we often talk about the fact that we've had a housing crisis before this pandemic and the economic challenges, and it's only worsened over the last year. And I know that's true across the state, and it's particularly hit lower income communities and communities of color. So I've asked Chief Executive Benjamin today to talk about her community and how these pandemic and economic challenges are impacting her community members, particularly related to housing. So Chief Executive Benjamin, if you're on, welcome. We'd love to hear from you.
Ani Buju, good morning. I am Melanie Benjamin from the Mille Band of Ojibwe, and I am the elected tribal chairperson, or we call Chief Executive. And thank you for the invitation today. And I enjoyed listening to the two representatives, because I think this whole topic of housing, how important it is to whoever we are. And it's about wellness, it's about employment, it's about health, it's all of these things. And for the Mille Band, over the years, we've been in a situation where it was really hard for us to receive loans for mortgages. On our reservation, we didn't have the ability to have a lot of housing. And so if you went off the reservation, it was very difficult. And so what happened back in the 90s, that we had the opportunity for a new economic development tool. And that gave us the opportunity to start to pick up our tribal members and put them in positions of employment. We thought housing was one of the most important things that we needed to focus on. And so we started to build housing. And so we worked with the HUD, and we received very limited amount of funding to do housing. And at one point in our history, we were able to build maybe 5 houses a year. And of course, that's very difficult when you have a large population that needs homes. And so as we were successful with our economic development, we determined that housing was very important. And so we allocated a percentage of our revenue to that whole concept of housing. And then we gave the opportunity to our membership, if they wanted to purchase a home, that we would provide a loan program for them. And then we charged an interest rate of 2% for our tribal members to actually secure a home loan and to purchase or buy a home. And many of our members want to stay on the reservation. This is their homeland. This is where the family is, and the component of all of our history, from our ancestors to our future. And so many people wanted to build on the reservation, but because of all the various barriers, that you could not get conventional loans. And so we all are aware of the loan program, and under HUD is the Home Loan Guarantee Program, Section 184. And so we do have that program with our local bank, and which is Woodlands National Bank. And they have provided over 200 of these Section 184 loans in the past 10 years. And so that goes throughout the whole state of Minnesota. So if you think about all of those 240 of those loans were actually to the Mille Band of Ojibwe. And for people that wanted to build on the reservation, that there was a lot of barriers because of how our status of tribal lands is. And we have, I guess, a couple of categories. We have trust lands. And trust lands are lands that are held in trust for by the federal government for the benefit of the Mille Band. And then also, if we were able to purchase lands, then we have fee lands. And until those fee lands go into trust, they're taxable. And so then we provide that tax payment to the local county. And of course, if your lands are in trust, that's a good thing, because that means your lands are protected. Nobody can take them away. But the problem is that with commercial lenders, that if you are to provide a mortgage to a potential landowner, then and a person defaults on a loan, that lender would be stuck with a building, but they did not own it. And so a lot of people were concerned about that. So we were pretty excited with Senator Tina Smith and her legislation to change some of that, and that would make a huge difference for all of us on Indian country. And so what was pretty interesting is that we have probably over 300 people currently on our housing list that want to get in homes on the reservation, but of course we don't have the ability to provide those homes. And the majority of our stock of homes are rental. And our goal is home ownership. So that individual can have the pride of owning a home and passing that down to their children if they so desire. And so we do a lot of different types of programs. We want people to own their own homes, but we also have elder programs and elder housing, of course, where you're allowed to live in the Mille band's housing stock. And so we provide that mortgage-free, rent-free for you, and you're able to stay there as long as you desire. And we wanted to make sure that we always protected our elders and they had a place to go. We also have assisted living units for elders that need the additional help. And so when we think about all of these 300 band members are on the waiting list looking and hoping that they get a house allocated, it's difficult. And even the normal a way of securing funding to build houses and things like that has been a challenge over the years. And because we were successful in economic development, we're now able to start focusing on that. But again, it takes a long time to build the houses and things of that sort. And so that's why we really want to focus on home ownership. So we give that ability to the individual to either purchase an existing home, and it may be off the reservation, or to build off the reservation, because of all of the federal bureaucracies that we have to deal with as a tribe, makes it a little more time consuming and difficult to move some of these things forward. But we are happy that we're moving forward, and we're always looking at what is the best practices for us to secure housing. The other thing I think is pretty alarming, we have some big issues, is that with our county, Mille County, we had an issue with a law enforcement agreement, and they revoked our agreement. And they said our law enforcement officers didn't have the right, and they were impersonating police officers. So anyway, what that did is it opened up the reservation to a lot of negative elements. We had a lot of drug dealers come, we had gang members, because they viewed the band as a police-free zone. So then you had people going into the houses, people started getting addicted, and now we have a lot of issues where that individuals are addicted to drugs, and they're not living up to their responsibilities. And that's one of the biggest barriers in terms of that negative relationship that you may have with the county has a huge impact on the reservation. Either it's a perfect relationship if you're good, or it's terrible if they want to fight you based on they believe that your reservations don't exist. And so therefore you don't have that ability, and they don't recognize you as a government to move forward. And everything we do on the reservation, we have to have those partnerships with our counties. And so now we have to go back years and years and years to be able to now to help people to get well again so they can assume those responsibilities. And so when we talk about barriers, that's a huge barrier, because we do have really good relationships with some of the financial institutions, the state of Minnesota, and ability to utilize the opportunities are there. But there are other things that will hold you back, like a law enforcement agreement with your local county that has such a huge negative impact. Sure. And through the state of Minnesota, there has to be a relationship through the state legislature to actually come up with new ways to have these law enforcement agreements work for all of us. And so that's...
Well, as you're describing this, it just reminds me of the complexities because of the ownership and financing structures that your community faces in addressing these housing issues. I really appreciate your insights on that. I have I had a number of questions. We're a little short on time. I know that with 2 casinos in your community, and knowing that our lowest wage earners are really at most risk during all of this and most impacted by COVID and the communities. So a lot of the housing programs and work and investments and strategies are going to be hitting your community most directly. We have about 30 seconds, and then I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth Glynn to talk about the federal level. We had, as you noted, Senator Tina Smith on 2 weeks ago talking about that legislation you referenced as well. Any last thoughts? I just also wanted to thank you for your work and your service on the Minnesota Housing Board. I think that's a really important perspective.
And I think with closing, thank you for inviting me, and that we are going to work as hard as we can to provide the best housing that we can. And just when the pandemic hit us, we were the first tribe to shut our businesses down because we knew that we had to do something. So we had months and months where we were making zero profit. And so that is going to take us, I don't know how long, to be able to come back to start providing that revenue for the services that we provide. But we'll do it. We will work hard, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. So with that, I want to turn this over then to our Deputy Executive Director of MHP and our Director of Policy, Elizabeth Glidden. We are delighted to have an expert talking with us about some federal policy initiatives as well. Elizabeth?
Thanks so much, Anne. And yes, we are very fortunate today to have as a guest Sarah Saadian. She is the Vice President of Public Policy at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And in this week in particular, as there is so much change happening at the federal level, we are fortunate to have her expertise. As we get going here, I just wanted to extend really a personal thank you to Sarah for her leadership, as well as her colleagues at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. They really have extended over the past year extra efforts to involve folks all around the country in being more knowledgeable about what's happening at the federal level and partnering in advocacy efforts, regularly seeking input to design strategy, sharing research that is helpful. So this week already we have heard from President Biden several actions that are quite significant. At the end of last year, Congress passed a stimulus and fiscal year spending bill that included $25 billion for emergency rental assistance and extended for a short amount of time moratorium on evictions. President Biden has now ordered those moratoriums to be extended further through executive order through March 31st. He has also announced what his proposal around COVID relief will be. So with our time with Sarah, we were hoping that we might start by getting some updates on the National Low Income Housing Coalition's more immediate advocacy priorities, including how they're interacting with the new administration, what they think is most likely to be happening in these next few weeks and months. And as part of that, we're hoping also to have some conversation about guidance on the emergency rental assistance program. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, and we'll have a conversation.
Great. It's so good to be here with you this morning. Thank you so much. I wanted to share a little bit about how we're engaging with the administration on emergency rental assistance and other needs. Sorry about that. So as Elizabeth mentioned, $25 billion was passed in December. The administration has 30 days, or I should say the federal government, because it transitioned from one administration to another. They have 30 days to issue those funds to state and local governments. So we expect the funds to start going out as soon as next week. That'll be the 30-day mark. And we're trying to engage with them as closely as possible about guidance that they provide to state and local governments when they're implementing and sharing those resources. Right before the Trump administration left, so the day before, they issued their first FAQ document, frequently asked questions document, and we're really stressed that that document in many places went against the written language in the statute and would have made it much more difficult to serve renters who have the lowest incomes, more difficult to serve marginalized populations, and would have imposed really burdensome documentation requirements that would slow down the spending of money. We issued a letter to the new incoming administration, Secretary nominee Janet Yellen and nominee Marcia Fudge at HUD, urging them to very quickly amend that FAQ and provide additional guidance to state and local governments so that resources can go quickly. I'm going to share in the chat box a link to a letter that we sent to them earlier this week, yesterday, urging them to make really immediate changes. And we're hoping, and I'd say not 100% confident, but I think it's likely that we'll see them make adjustments to that very soon. So keep an eye out for that. We certainly will be. In terms of the eviction moratorium, we did see the president sign an executive order on day one to extend the moratorium. And that's another place where we are going to be engaging with the director of the Center for Disease Control and other officials to try to improve that moratorium and make that stronger. As many of you know, there are a lot of shortfalls and flaws with the existing moratorium that leave renters unprotected. And so we want to make sure that as many renters can be protected as possible. In terms of next steps for the next COVID package, we know that things are moving very quickly. President Biden unveiled his proposal for the next COVID package. It included housing and homelessness resources. It included about $25 billion in emergency rental assistance, $5 billion in emergency utility assistance, and another $5 billion in homelessness assistance. All of those resources are extremely important and very much needed, but we think that more resources are needed to address the scope of the problems that are out there. So in the chat box, I'll share with you a document that shows our most urgent priorities for this next COVID package. These are things where you can be playing a role in talking to your members of Congress about the need for these resources. I think the biggest change here is that we're starting to have a little bit of breathing room. Before, Congress was very focused on the most immediate needs that were right ahead of us. And now we're taking a step back to say, okay, let's think a little bit longer term. What other resources are needed here? And so one of the things you'll notice is that we added a call for $28 billion in more housing vouchers. These are longer term assistance tools that can help address people's ongoing housing needs rather than just their immediate needs. And we also call for acquisition funds that can be used to create more permanent affordable housing, especially for people who are currently experiencing homelessness. We know that people experiencing homelessness are at much higher risk of contracting COVID. They're more likely to be hospitalized, they're more likely to die. And it's really important that we start thinking about shifting away from our congregate shelter system to a housing focused system. And so this is something that we're really focused on for the next COVID package. And finally, I'll just say that there's a lot of interest, especially with a Democratic House, Senate, and White House, about what are the housing opportunities going forward under the Biden administration. I think this is a really unique opportunity to get major housing legislation done. I'm sure many of you might have heard that Democrats are considering doing a very large infrastructure / stimulus / climate change / all of the above bill, probably later on in the summer. And then they're going to use something called budget reconciliation to help them do that. That's a process that only requires a simple majority in the Senate, so 51 votes, which Democrats have, rather than the 60 votes that are typically needed in the Senate. And so that way, if Democrats hold together, we can push through major legislation. Now, there's some limits on how you can use budget reconciliation, but the major thing that we need to know is this is a place where we can start to get big dollars for housing. And so we're going to be making a push for universal housing vouchers. I know that many of you know only 1 in 4 people who are eligible for housing assistance get it. It's essentially a lottery system. Many people have to wait for years on waiting lists to get assistance, and that's wrong. We want to have housing programs be treated like every other safety net program and to make funding for it mandatory so that everyone who is eligible can get assistance. Other things that we're pushing for are major investments in housing infrastructure, so funding for public housing repair, the National Housing Trust Fund, and other resources to build housing or preserve housing for people with the very lowest incomes. And so we think that those are major opportunities to move forward on Congress. I think there's an enormous opportunity to move things on the regulatory side. The #1 focus of this administration is likely to be undoing the damage done by the Trump administration, particularly around fair housing and civil rights. So I expect that will be a major focus of them starting on day 1. So with that, I'll see if folks have any questions. And
yeah, so I see a couple questions in the chat that kind of go to your updates about vouchers and voucher advocacy, including the universal voucher. So what I'm seeing are questions that are a little bit around sort of the process and what will be the appetite for this? I think another question I had is whether you believe from all the effort you have spent on working with the last Congress around emergency rental assistance, how that messaging might help or lead into this effort around voucher expansion.
yeah, that's a great question. So I'll start off with the one around how much appetite there is. We know that President Biden included universal housing vouchers in his housing platform during the campaign. We think there is really broad, especially for the people who've moved into the administration, political appointees and career staff at HUD, there is an appetite there. But we also know that we can't just wait and expect Congress to do these things. We have to be pushing them. We have to be advocating and educating them about why it's needed. There's going to be a lot of different competing priorities to make it into these bills. We want to make sure that universal housing vouchers and housing investments are at the top of the list. So it is definitely going to require a lot of advocacy. And in terms of how we're framing this or the messaging around it, I think one of the things that we can all say from this experience of being through a pandemic is that the pandemic has really underscored just how critical housing is to health. I think it's a lot easier for people not in the housing space to see that connection now. And I think it's also very clear that there are significant gaps in our safety net programs that need to be fixed so that we're better prepared for the next time that there's a crisis. If we had universal vouchers during this pandemic, we wouldn't see millions of households who are behind on their rent and who are facing eviction and who are possibly becoming homeless. It would be a game changer in terms of preparing our country for the next disaster that happens. So that's the way that we're framing it. We know that other groups working in other spaces are also focusing on how we can build back from this pandemic in a way that better prepares us for future disasters. So that's the messaging that we're using.
So we're kind of rounding out, running out of time. I wonder if I can go back for a second to the advocacy around the emergency rental assistance, just because in some ways, I think for some people, our minds are on the next thing, but this is critically important assistance, and really it's a lot of concern about the guidance that has been issued. Do you have any thoughts you want to share on how soon we might see some response from Treasury? I know we've already had asked for how to coordinate some advocacy from Minnesota, so I think we're going to be trying to do that even later today, coordinate some advocacy, asking our members of Congress to help weigh in with Treasury.
I think we might see something from Treasury as soon as next week or maybe the week after. Because the money is going to start going out to states and communities in the next couple of weeks, I'm sure that Treasury is going to want there to be guidance alongside that money so that states and local governments can start spending as quickly as possible. It's very possible that Treasury could issue a shorter FAQ and then provide a longer one coming in later. We're gonna encourage them to move as quickly as possible, but timing is a little bit unknown just right now.
Any last words you want to say about how we stay in touch? We had a great suggestion from Sue Watliff Phillips about giving you a chance to do a little commercial, National Low Income Housing Coalition.
Sure. So I want to invite, well, one, I want to thank everybody here for all of their advocacy over the last 10 months. It's been an enormous amount of work, but we were very successful, all of us together, in getting resources to address housing and homelessness, and that's because of your work and your advocacy. We want to keep that going. One way that people can continue to stay involved is you can join our weekly national calls every Monday, 2:30 to 4 Eastern time, where we share the latest on federal updates. We hear from local communities about what's going on there. I share a Capitol Hill update. It's a one-source information of everything that you need. We also have working groups, if you're interested in that, a policy working group that talks about the nuts and bolts of legislation that's moving, a group that's focused on FEMA resources and how to access those for people experiencing homelessness, and a state and local implementation group where we talk about how to design rental assistance programs so that they're truly meeting the needs of our residents, or how do we use ESG dollars in the best way possible. So there's lots of opportunities. I can share a link to that in the chat box too for people who want to sign up. And I think we have, it's good to reflect on the successes that all of us have had, take a breather, and then go right back into it because we have a lot of work ahead of us this year.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. We are grateful for your partnership. And with that, I'm turning it back to Ann to close us out.
Great. Yes, thank you so much. And I know I listened to, Sarah, your updates each week on the NLIHC calls as well nationally. Super helpful and insightful for our folks here. So I just want to thank you to all the speakers today. It was really insightful, helpful insights and work that you all are doing. And thank you to all of you who are joining us. A reminder, our next call is on Friday, February 5th. And we are trying to do these Friday calls every 2 weeks. And we've already got a great lineup on February 5th, which will include our State Senator Rich Draheim, who is the chair of our Housing, Finance, and Policy Committee in the Senate. And we'll also be hosting Minnesota Housing Commissioner Jennifer Ho, who will give us a peek at the governor's budget and other kinds of administrative proposals that they'll be advancing this legislative session. So make sure to sign up for those and join us on February 5th. So we are absolutely delighted to offer this opportunity to all of you to regularly hear from lawmakers. And if you have suggestions for specific topics or speakers, certainly let me or Libby or Elizabeth know, and we'll do our best to make sure that we're covering the topics that are of interest to you all. It's clear that there is a lot of work to do, and there's also a lot of work underway in responding to all these housing challenges. I'm grateful that all of you are bringing your energy and talents to this work. Right now I'm looking outside, the sun is shining, and I'm feeling hopeful that we will all together make some really needed advances. So thank you for joining us again, and have a great day.